Hey, you guys, and welcome back to the podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about soil blocking. Soil blocking is a method of indoor seed starting that became very popular with home gardeners several years ago, and I was one of them. The benefits are hard to argue, but after many years of consistently using soil blocks, I started seeing some drawbacks in my own personal experience that has led me to another method, one with almost all of the same benefits, but none of the drawbacks. So if you're considering using soil blocks for indoor seed starting, or you found yourself running into issues, my hope is that this episode will give you some options. Soil blocking is still a very good method that many gardeners and farmers use extensively, and hopefully by the end of this episode, you'll learn whether this is the right method for you. If you're joining me on YouTube, welcome. We are going to be posting some of the podcast episodes here on YouTube, so I hope you enjoy, but not all of them will be on here. So make sure if you listen to podcasts to subscribe to the Beginner's Garden podcast wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Now, one benefit to YouTube today is that I can actually show you my soil blocker, because if you're new to soil blocking and you don't know what it is, you can definitely look up online, but this is the soil blocker that I'm going to be referring to when we talk about compressed soil. The soil actually goes in here, and then you press that down, and then you get these compressed soil blocks. So I'll talk about that more in just a minute, but I just wanted you to see what that looks like before we get started. Before we get into soil blocks and explaining what they are, how they benefit you, and why I'm actually going away from them, understand that soil blocking isn't something that I would necessarily recommend to a beginning seed starter. What I use now is actually a great option. We're going to get to that, but it does require a little bit more of an investment than most of us do in the beginning. So these concepts that we're talking about today are definitely some to keep in mind for the future. But for this year, I recommend that you plan on attending the Beginner's Guide to Indoor Seed Starting. It's a workshop live online on Thursday, January 11th. We will have a replay, so if you are listening to this after that, then you can definitely check out the replay and get a ticket after the fact. But if you are listening to this before, I recommend you get your ticket, and we'll be live for this workshop, and we'll have Q&A and all of that. This particular workshop is going to take you from planning to planting to growing to potting up to hardening off to planting out in the garden. And like I said, if you can't make it live, you can still purchase your ticket, and we will send you a replay link after the fact. You can go to journeywithjill.net/seed starting workshop, or we'll have the link below. If you've never heard of the term, what are soil blocks? Well, soil blocking is a containerless way to start seeds. What you do is you have compressed soil. There's a mold that you buy, and you put dampened soil mix, and there is a special mix that you're supposed to blend. I tend to just use potting mix. Sometimes I'll use half potting mix, half peat moss. That can be a little bit complicated, but a lot of times I just use straight pro mix, and I just add water to it. But you use the mold and you add the water to this mix, and then you can basically use this, and it compresses it into a block of soil with a little bit of a divot at the top for the seed to go onto. Now, the cost for the soil blocker, the one that I have, is now it's about $45. I don't think it was this expensive when I bought it several years ago. But consider, this is an investment. However, you're not going to have to buy trays or anything like that in the future, and you can make as many as you want to. Obviously, this can be used for multiple uses, and that's why I think a lot of farmers and people who do a lot of bulk seed starting really like the soil blocker. The one I have and use the most is a 2x2x2. So that is the square of a soil block that you're going to have. There are other options. I've tried the smaller one. I think it's a 3/4 of an inch. I have not really liked that, but I know other people do. And then there's also a larger one that will do a large block. Again, I haven't actually done that one, but a lot of people do. Most people start out with the one that's the 2x2x2 to begin their soil blocking. What are the benefits of soil blocks? Why are so many people going to soil blocks? Why is it so popular, especially among market gardeners? The biggest benefit to soil blocks, in my opinion, is that you get a healthier plant because upon transplanting, whether you're potting up into a larger container or you're going directly into the garden, the roots establish super quick. The reason is because since you don't have a container itself, the roots are not going to circle around the container. If you've ever bought a transplant at the garden center, especially one that's been sitting on the shelf for a while, and you take the little seedling out of that plastic cell tray, you notice that the roots are circling. And really, that was what I thought was normal because that's all I ever saw from the time I was little. And my mom taught me how to plant flowers in the garden. She told me, take them out, rough up the roots so that you can get them from circling. Well, the soil blocker prevents that altogether. What ends up happening is that the roots will grow to the edge of the soil, and then they'll stop when they hit that space, that air. And then that will send a message to the plant to continue to produce roots from the center of the plant. So instead of roots circling this long root structure, you have a more dense root structure that stops at the edge. And then once it's planted into a larger medium, whether that's a larger pot or it's directly in the garden, those roots are poised to take off and start growing into the soil around them. I found this to be a huge benefit and not just marketing hype. I could tell as soon as I transplanted anything from a soil block into something larger, they took off very, very quickly. So this is absolutely a benefit. You're able to get the crops to maturity faster, less transplant shock because they're not growing from this, cramped, contained environment to room. They're just basically, when you plant them at the right time, they're just continuing their growth without any kind of stunted period. So I found that the plants themselves are a lot more healthy. Another thing is that soil blocking eliminates the waste of plastic pots, which is something that we buy, the cheap and flimsy plastic pots. They might last a year or two and then you have to toss them. But then also it eliminates the need of having to store them. All you have to do is save your soil block maker, and that takes up less room in storage. You don't have to worry about cell trays or anything like that. I mean, you'll want your 10, 20 tray to actually put them in. But as far as seed packs, cell packs, you're not going to have any of that to have to store them. And another benefit of soil blocking is you can create a lot of soil blocks quickly. You can go through, once you get your mix made up, you can do these blocks really fast. So you're able to do bulk indoor seed starting a lot more quickly than you would having to pack your cell trays and all of that. Now, what I liked about using soil blocks, like I mentioned, it was super easy to transplant. What I love to do is you just basically take this block of soil and you dig a hole and you put it in and you put it back and you're done. There's not any taking out of a container. There's not any teasing the roots apart. It's just such a quicker process to be able to transplant, whether it's potting up or whether it's going into the ground. And the process goes really fast. As I mentioned before, the seedlings take off when they're planted, the roots are primed, and it's faster to plant a lot of seedlings at once. So if I have a whole lot of lettuce, I can get a lot of those planted quicker than if I were using a cell pack of some sort. Another benefit that nobody really talks about that I thought was really neat is because you plant the seed on top of the soil block, there's a little divot there. You plant the seed on top of the soil block, you can actually watch germination happen. And to me, that was the most fascinating thing because you could watch that seed, the outside of the seed shell break open. And then after it broke open, you could see the little sprout coming up. This was, I think, the most fun to watch when I was doing squash because the squash seed is really big and you're able to see the seed of that squash break open and that little sprout come out. And often you can see the roots trying to find that soil and you could just see the little nodules on the roots before it goes into the soil block. And just watching that process was really fun. I think that was fun for me to bring my kids in and say, look at this. Most of the time this is done underground. You can't see what's going on, but for this, you can watch it. So I thought that was really neat. Another thing that I thought was helpful is that while I was doing the indoor seed starting process and the plant was starting to grow, I could monitor the root growth. A lot of times when you're planting in a regular plastic cell tray, a cell pack, you you're not quite sure what the roots are doing because you can't see them. You can see if maybe there are a few coming out of the bottom or something like that. But for the most part, you can't see them. With a soil block, you can monitor the root growth. You can see as the roots start to expand into the soil block, and you can get an idea if it's ready to be transplanted or not. So that was something that was really helpful, I thought, and fun too. But over the years, and I've done soil blocks for, goodness, I think 6 years I've been planting with soil blocks. I found some drawbacks that got me to going a different direction to where I really am not planning on using soil blocking much this year, and I'll explain why. Number one, to me, I found that it's not as convenient for smaller batches. If I'm just doing, like 6 or 12 celery plants, for instance, and I have to plant celery and I don't have to plant anything else at the same time, that's really not so efficient because it takes a while to mix up the seed starting mix that you're putting in your soil blocks. Whether that's something simple like I just started doing the Pro Mix with water, or you're doing the actual mix, making up a mix. Elliot Coleman has a mix that he uses for soil blocks. That takes time to make this huge batch of soil block mix. And if you are going to use his recipe, which you can find online or in his book, it took a while for me to source it all, like to source this, I think it was sand and certain compost and like all these ingredients. It took a while to source. But if you're using a whole lot and you're doing a whole lot of them, obviously it eventually works out. But to me, for smaller batches for my garden, it really seemed to be a lot of work if I didn't have a lot of seedlings that I was doing at the same time. Another thing is that I started finding that almost all of the seeds that I started indoors, I started finding that I was potting them up into a larger container instead of planting them directly out into the garden. I found personally that the seedlings are more healthy when I can pot them up, when they can go from wherever I start the seed to a size up and then let them grow in that before I plant them out to the garden. I found that to be more beneficial to them. And so the whole benefit of planting just this block of soil directly in the garden, I really wasn't enjoying that all that much because I was potting up. Now, granted, putting a block of soil in a container is definitely quicker than taking it out of a container. But still, I thought, well, what's the benefit of doing this so fast if I'm going to pot it all up anyway? Now, one thing I will often put directly in the garden is lettuce. I'll put that directly in my green stalk planter or something like that. And still, I think lettuce for me is a good option for soil blocking. But for everything else that I'm potting up, I just found it to, not have the benefit that I was hoping for. But the biggest thing that I found was really a struggle for me over the years was water regulation. Water regulation with indoor seed starting is a challenge anyway, but I found it to be harder with soil blocks, especially for the plants that took a long time to germinate, like celery and like peppers. I really struggled with those more so than the fast growing plants like squash and like tomatoes. Those were easier. Broccoli was easy, lettuce is easy, but some of the other ones, it was harder to regulate the soil moisture, because they were either oversaturated and then they would start developing mold on top. And then if the seed hadn't germinated yet, it would cause the seeds not to germinate, or it would dry out really fast. Or if I had different crops that germinated at different rates and I had them all in the same tray, it was hard to keep some soil blocks from getting too wet and some from getting too dry. I just found the regulation of moisture was a lot more challenging. Now, people who use soil blocking mostly or primarily, they will use mats of some sort at the bottom and use the capillary action in creating these special cloths to put at the bottom. Honestly, I've just never messed with that. I'm sure it works great. I see people doing it all the time. But because I was just focused on putting these blocks on my ridged 10-20 tray and water from the bottom, it was just something that I found that was a little bit more difficult to regulate. But I really did enjoy, as I mentioned, the benefits of the health of the plant, being able to have the plant not suffer transplant shock and to be able to get going quicker and get really well established was something that I didn't want to lose by going back to my regular method of using cell trays. That was until I found Epic cell trays. For those of you on YouTube, I'm showing you what this looks like. This looks like your regular cell tray, but these are called Epic cell trays. Epic Gardening sells them, and you can tell they are firm plastic. What I love about these is that at the bottom, there's a very large hole. And then on the sides, there are large little slits around the whole little cell block here. Now, what I like about this is that I've found that the benefits of not circling roots definitely happens here in this Epic cell tray. The roots do not circle. They air prune, whether that's on the side slits or on the bottom. And not only that, but whenever I transplant them, because the bottom has such large holes, I can just use my finger to pop out the transplant, and that makes it easier. Now, not as easy as just popping out the soil block into the garden, but much easier than having to squeeze a plastic cell tray and wiggle it out and try not to grab the stem when you're not supposed to grab the stem to get the thing dislodged. And another thing, because the roots aren't circling, it's not holding on to the container altogether. So this has been such a game changer for me. Another thing is that it is reusable, so it eliminates plastic waste. I can imagine these are going to last years, if not decades. I've used them and they have not had any issues whatsoever. So I know they're going to last a long time, and I've actually just gotten rid of all of my old plastic trays just to use these. I think besides the root pruning and the health of the plant, I think one of the biggest reasons I like going with these cell trays is because I can plant a few plants at a time. I can just make a small batch of mix or just use my seed starting mix and moisten them and pack, one or two of these would be fine. Sometimes I do more, obviously, depending on the crop. But if I just want to do a few, I can without having to make a big batch of mix. Another benefit to this is water regulation is so much easier. I love how it has the benefits of the root pruning, but because it does have hard, rigid sides, that helps with the water regulation. So I feel like I can definitely keep the water regulated for healthy plants better. One thing that I did start doing is for the larger batches of seeds that I start, like tomatoes or peppers, I find that I like using these in the dense planting method better. Now, this is an advanced method of planting from seed indoors. What I'll do is I'll take one variety of a tomato, for example, and also maybe 12 seeds in one cell. Once they start to germinate, then I will take them out, I'll separate them, and then I will plant them out in their own individual cell. But that makes it where I only am transplanting out the ones that germinated. I don't have to worry about ones that didn't germinate. This has been really easy to do, the dense planting method. And then once they get too big for this, then I can move them up to a larger container, whether it's they have larger Epic cell trays that are bigger than this, or just a regular, like a 4-inch pot. They're really easy to pot up from these. Now, the cost of the Epic cell trays are still going to be an investment, but it's something that you're going to use for a long time, just like the soil blocker. It's one of those things that I've gotten just a few more every year to be able to add to what I'm doing. But that's why I've really enjoyed going to these Epic cell trays. But still, some people do want to use soil blocks, and you might want to know, is soil blocking right for me? For me, I would say that if you are starting a lot of seeds, then I think soil blocking is still a fantastic method. And it's a method, like I said, that many market farms and larger scale home gardeners use and rely on. But if you are a smaller scale gardener, a home gardener, you're not starting a ton of seeds all at once, I think maybe the soil block may be a little bit overkill. Now, it's definitely something that, if you want to consider it, definitely has its benefits, as I mentioned earlier in the episode. But I just thought, because I've used this method for 6-7 years, I thought it would be a good time to come back to the subject, since I've talked about it a little bit on the podcast over the years, and just tell you kind of where I've landed after having used it for a long time, and also after having used the Epic cell trays for a few seasons, kind of where I've ended up landing on all of that. But to sum up, here's what I want to share with you, especially if you're a beginning gardener. I started using plastic single-use cell trays in the beginning, and if you're a beginner, You don't have to select from one of these two options that I've given you. You don't have to decide whether you want to do soil blocks. You don't have to decide whether you want to invest in Epic cell trays, because they are both investments, and either one is going to be a little bit pricey up front if you're on a budget. So specifically if you're a beginner, and specifically if you're on a budget, I'd encourage you to spend your money on a good grow light and use cheaper cell trays for your container of choice this year. I'll go into some of those options, including some no-cost options in the seed starting workshop. But then in the future, you could look at leveling up to something like the soil blocker or these Epic cell trays. Or maybe you buy a few Epic cell trays and then you build on them each year, kind of like what I've done. But I did want you to know, if you're a beginning gardener, these are not your only two options, but they are definitely options to consider as you expand and as you consider what supplies that you need for your indoor seed starting. I hope you've enjoyed this look at my personal experience and opinion on using soil blocks to maybe help you decide if that's right for you or if another method is better. I'm going to be going more into the supplies that I recommend and use. I started out at the bare basics at the beginning, and I can tell you what I have added on over the years and whether I think it's worth it or maybe more of an optional thing. We'll talk a lot about supplies in the seed starting workshop. So make sure and get your ticket. You can go to journeywithjill.net/seed starting workshop or check out the links in the description. Thank you for hanging in with me on YouTube. And if you're liking watching these on YouTube, please let me know in the comments below. And for back episodes, make sure to check out the Beginner's Garden podcast on wherever you listen to podcasts.